Could a single-engine fighter plane fly 560 miles into the very heart of an empire, engage in combat, and return? At 0742 on the morning of March 6, 1944, the Luftwaffe High Command was certain it was impossible. Their intelligence was clear. No American single-engine fighter possessed the range to reach Berlin. The round trip was a staggering 1,100 miles. Every fighter the Americans had, the P-47 Thunderbolt, the P-38 Lightning, had turned back, their fuel tanks empty, hundreds of miles from the capital. German pilots had turned this knowledge into a deadly science. They waited patiently, just beyond the reach of the American escorts, a ghostly perimeter where bomber crews ran out of protection. Then they would tear into the defenseless formations. American bomber losses over Germany had become catastrophic. In October 1943, 60 B-17 flying fortresses were annihilated in a single mission to Schweinfurt, a full 20% of the attacking force. The daylight bombing campaign was bleeding out. But on this morning, Colonel Donald Blakesley, sitting in the cockpit of his P-51 Mustang, was preparing to lead a mission the Luftwaffe insisted could not happen. Blakesley's Mustang harbored a secret, a capability the Germans had calculated out of existence. Under each wing hung a 108-gallon drop tank. These paper tanks, manufactured in Britain, gave his Mustang a combat radius of 850 miles. Combined with its internal fuel, the P-51 could fly to Berlin, fight for 20 minutes, and come home. The Luftwaffe High Command had declared this impossible. Their calculations were certain. Their intelligence reports confirmed it. Their pilots were briefed they would never see an enemy fighter over Berlin. They were all wrong. Blakesley was 26 years old, but he was a veteran, fighting Germans since 1941, first with the Royal Air Force's Eagle Squadron, then with the U.S. Army Air Force's 4th Fighter Group. He had flown over 500 combat missions, more than any American pilot in the war. He understood the horrific cost of unescorted raids. He had watched too many B-17s fall in flames simply because their fighter cover had to turn back. Now, for the first time, he was about to lead single-engine fighters all the way to the Nazi capital. What transpired in the next 7 hours would shatter the strategic balance of the air war over Europe. The first bomber crew the 4th Fighter Group lost to this lethal gap in protection was Lieutenant Robert Harriman's B-17 crew on August 17, 1943. Hermann had been in England for just 2 months. It was their 7th mission. Their target, the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt, deep in enemy territory. The P-47s escorted them to the German border, and then, their fuel gauges critical, they peeled away and turned for home. The Luftwaffe waited. They knew precisely when the American fighters would leave. German fighter controllers watched the P-47s turn west, then unleashed their pilots. Over 300 Messerschmitt Bf-10-9s and Focke-Wulf 190 swarmed the bomber formations. 20 minutes after the escorts vanished, Hermann's B-17 was struck. Cannon fire ripped into the No. 3 engine and it burst into flame. The pilot feathered the prop, but the fire wouldn't die. 2 more German fighters closed in from 6 o'clock, walking cannon shells through the fuselage. The tail section fractured and broke away. The bomber fell out of formation, spinning toward the earth. 3 crew members managed to get out. 7 did not. The mission lost 36 bombers, 260 men killed or captured, all beyond the range of their fighter escort. The second crew was Captain James O'Connor's B-24, lost near Stuttgart on September 6th. O'Connor was an experienced flight leader with 14 missions. His formation struck the Bosch Magneto plant. The P-38s escorted them as far as their fuel allowed, roughly 400 miles from England, and then they turned back. The Luftwaffe struck 30 seconds later. O'Connor's crew radioed they were under attack by 15 to 20 fighters. They pleaded for help. No fighters were available. They were alone, 150 miles inside Germany, 40 bombers against 300 German interceptors. O'Connor's aircraft took multiple 20-millimeter cannon hits. The right-wing fuel tank exploded. The bomber rolled, inverted, and dove straight down from 22,000 feet. No parachutes were seen. 10 men gone. By October 1943, the 8th Air Force had lost 194 heavy bombers in 3 months. The vast majority shot down after their escorts were forced to return to base. The crews had a name for it: going naked. German pilots called it happy hunting time. They would position their fighters just beyond that invisible line of American fuel range and wait. When the escorts turned back, the Germans attacked in overwhelming numbers. The bombers' 50-caliber machine guns were a brave defense, but they couldn't stop a determined pilot making a 400-mile-per-hour head-on attack. The bomber crews were being killed faster than they could be replaced. The situation was unsustainable. The breaking point was the second Schweinfurt raid, October 14, 1943. Of 320 heavy bombers, 60 were shot down. 600 men were killed or captured in a single day. Another 17 bombers were damaged beyond repair. The total loss rate was 29%. General Henry Arnold, commanding the U.S. Army Air Forces, ordered a stop to all deep penetration missions. The losses were too high. The crews were exhausted. Replacement pilots, arriving with inadequate training, were being killed on their first or second missions. Something had to change. Without long-range fighter escort, the daylight bombing campaign could not continue. And without the daylight bombing campaign, the planned invasion of Europe might fail. The Germans would have time to reinforce their defenses, build more weapons, train more pilots. The war could drag on for years. More American soldiers would die on the beaches of France if the Luftwaffe was not broken first. The problem wasn't the bombers. B-17s and B-24s had the range to strike anywhere in Germany. The problem was they couldn't survive the flight. The P-47 Thunderbolt had a combat radius of only 375 miles, even with drop tanks. The P-38 Lightning had better range, around 450 miles, but suffered catastrophic problems in the cold, high altitudes over Europe. Its turbocharger systems failed so often that pilots coined a grim phrase for when both engines quit at 30,000 feet, getting P-38'd. The Spitfire, flown by the Royal Air Force, had brilliant performance, but, even with drop tanks, could barely reach Paris. The bomber crews paid the price. They flew into Germany knowing that, for terrifying stretches of the flight, they would be utterly vulnerable. They could see the German fighters high above them, circling like sharks, counting down the minutes until their little friends had to leave. Then the attacks would begin, wave after wave. German fighters diving through the formations, 20-millimeter and 30-millimeter cannons ripping apart the unarmored bombers. They knew where to aim. The cockpit, the engines, the wing-fuel tanks. They had been killing bombers for 2 years. They were very good at it. The solution arrived on December 20th, 1943, with the 354th Fighter Group, the P-51 Mustang. Its very existence was an unconventional gamble. In April 1940, the British had asked North American Aviation to build P-40 Warhawks. The company's president, James Kindleberger, made a counter-offer. His team could design a completely new, better fighter in the same amount of time. The British, skeptical but desperate, agreed. Led by designer Edgar Schmood, the team designed the complete aircraft in 117 days. The prototype flew in October 1940. The British called it the Mustang, but these early models used Allison engines, which performed poorly above 15,000 feet. They couldn't compete where the bombers flew. But then, a Rolls-Royce test pilot named Ronald Harker flew one in April 1942 and recognized its hidden potential. The airframe was a masterpiece, but the engine was wrong. Harker wrote a report suggesting that if the Allison was replaced with a Rolls-Royce Merlin, the aircraft would be revolutionary. The Merlin 61 engine, with its two-stage supercharger, could maintain power up to 30,000 feet. The British shipped 5 Mustang airframes to Rolls-Royce for conversion. The results were stunning. Top speed jumped from 365 to 441 miles per hour. The service ceiling rose to 42,000 feet. The aircraft was transformed. North American began producing Merlin-powered P-51B and P-51C models, the engine built under license in America. Its fuel capacity was extraordinary. An 85-gallon fuselage tank was added behind the pilot. With 2 108-gallon drop tanks, the P-51B could carry over 400 gallons. It could fly at 437 miles per hour, climb to 30,000 feet in under 8 minutes, and most importantly, fly for over 6 hours. With drop tanks, its combat radius extended to 850 miles. That was enough. That was Berlin. But the extra fuel created a new, dangerous problem. The fuselage tank, located behind the center of gravity, made the aircraft dangerously unstable. Test pilots reported that with a full fuselage tank, hard maneuvers caused the control stick to reverse its loads, meaning the pilot had to push forward on the stick to stop the nose from pitching up uncontrollably. The P-51B couldn't dogfight. It could barely maneuver. The solution was careful fuel management. Pilots were instructed to burn the fuselage tank fuel first, during the climb and cruise. Once that tank was empty, the center of gravity shifted forward, and the aircraft handled beautifully. But one mistake in managing the tanks, one miscalculation, and they would run out of fuel over Germany. The 354th Fighter Group flew its first P-51 escort mission on December 5, 1943. On December 13th, they flew to Kiel, 480 miles into Germany, the deepest penetration by single-engine fighters to date. The Luftwaffe sent up 200 fighters. The 354th shot down 8 and lost none. The P-51 worked. Major General James Doolittle, taking command of the 8th Air Force in January 1944, saw the potential immediately. The only way to win was to destroy the Luftwaffe, and the only way to do that was to force them to fight. He would do that by attacking targets they had to defend, targets like Berlin. To do that, he needed P-51s. He began converting groups from P-47s. The 4th Fighter Group was next. Colonel Donald Blakesley, its new commander, wanted the Mustang. He pushed hard. Major General William Kaptener was reluctant. Converting a group meant taking them off operations for weeks. Blakesley made an audacious offer. Give him the P-51s, and his group would be operational in 24 hours. Kaptener thought it was impossible. But Blakesley insisted. His pilots had flown Spitfires with the RAF. They knew the Merlin engine. His mechanics had worked on Merlins for years. Keeptainer agreed with one condition. If the group wasn't operational in 24 hours, Blakesley would be relieved of command. The 4th received their P-51s on February 26, 1944. Blakesley told his pilots, "Learn to fly them on the way to the target." Some pilots had less than 30 minutes of flight time in the Mustang before their first mission. The mechanics worked through the night. By February 28th, the 4th flew its first P-51 mission. Every aircraft returned safely. Blakesley had kept his promise. By early March, the 8th Air Force had enough P-51s to attempt the impossible. A daylight raid on Berlin with fighter escort all the way. The mission was scheduled for March 3rd, scrubbed by weather. They tried again on March 4th. Marginal weather, but acceptable. Over 600 bombers took off, escorted by over 650 fighters, including Blakesley's 48 Mustangs. The briefing map showed the route. Northeast, across the North Sea, over the Netherlands, straight to Berlin. The fighters would provide continuous cover. No bomber would go naked. German opposition was expected to be heavy, 300 to 400 fighters. Fuel management was critical. The math was terrifying and simple. If you ran out of fuel over Berlin, you were not going home. At 0742, they took off. 48 Mustangs, heavy with fuel, clawed their way into the gray English morning. The flight to Germany took 2.5 hours. The bombers were already ahead, a formation 70 miles long. At 0915, over the Netherlands, the 4th rendezvoused with their bomber group, positioning themselves 5,000 feet above. At 0935, they crossed the border. The first contrails appeared, high-altitude German fighters positioning for the attack. Blakesley counted 40, maybe 50. More appeared every minute. The Luftwaffe was scrambling everything. "Bandits forming up ahead." His voice crackled on the radio. "Estimate 50+. At 0958, the first German fighters dove. "Here they come," Blakesley called. "Break left and engage." The 4th turned into the attack. For 7 minutes, the sky was a violent chaos of twisting aircraft. The P-51s blocked the German attacks, turning inside them, forcing them to break off or die. Blakesley's own guns jammed, but he kept flying, forcing German fighters into the sights of his wingmen. Major James Goodson destroyed 2 F-19s. Captain Don Gentile exploded a Bf 109. The German fighters, low on fuel, finally broke off and dove away. The 4th Fighter Group had lost none of their own. They had shot down 5 confirmed. More importantly, every single bomber in their assigned group reached the target safely. Over Berlin, the sky turned black with flak. The bombers held formation, doors opening. From 30,000 feet, Blakesley watched the bombs fall, watched the explosions blossom across the city center. Berlin was burning. The bombers turned for home. More German fighters appeared, trying to pick off stragglers. The P-51s stayed with them, defending them all the way back across Germany, across the Netherlands, until they reached the safety of the North Sea. The mission took 6 hours and 40 minutes. Blakesley landed with just 20 gallons of fuel remaining, barely 10 minutes of flight. Every aircraft of the 4th Fighter Group returned. What none of the Americans knew was that on the ground, Reichsmarschall Hermann Goring, commander of the Luftwaffe, was watching. He saw the contrails of American fighters over his capital. He had been told it was impossible. And as he watched, he understood. The strategic balance had not just shifted, it had shattered. The Americans could now bomb any target in Germany with protection. There was nowhere left to hide. It was, Goring later confessed, the precise moment he knew Germany would lose the air war. The Americans returned on March 6th, this time 800 bombers and 900 fighters. Blakesley led the 4th back to the capital. The Luftwaffe was ready. They had pulled 350 fighters from every front. The battle became known as Black Monday, one of the largest air battles ever fought. The Luftwaffe had changed tactics. They attacked the escorts first. The losses were heavy on both sides. The Germans lost between 66 and 81 aircraft. The Americans lost 69 bombers and 11 fighters. But the mission was a success. Berlin was bombed again. The presence of P-51s over the city was now an undeniable, terrifying fact. On March 8th, the 4th returned again. This time, Captain Don Gentile and his wingman pioneered new aggressive tactics, shooting down 3 OBF-10-9s in a single engagement. The German aces themselves felt the shift. Luftwaffe Major Gwent Raoul, an ace with 275 victories, encountered P-51s at 28,000 feet over the city. After landing, he told his squadron, "The Americans have solved the range problem. They can escort their bombers anywhere now. We can't hide anymore." Johannes Steinhoff, another top ace, tried to dive through the escorts. A P-51 followed him down, caught him, and forced him into a turning fight he couldn't win. Steinhoff escaped to the treetops, landing with bullet holes in his rudder. "I couldn't shake him," he told his ground crew. "I don't know how we're supposed to beat them." The psychological impact was severe. The German advantage was gone. General Adolf Galland ordered his pilots to ignore the fighters and attack the bombers, but it was impossible. The P-51s were a wall. They were faster, they could turn, and there were hundreds of them. German intelligence, examining downed P-51s, found the paper drop tanks. But they also discovered the truth. The P-51 had been designed with an enormous internal fuel capacity from the beginning. The Germans had assumed a single-engine fighter could never have such range. They were wrong. By the end of March 1944, the Luftwaffe had lost over 400 fighter pilots. Replacements arrived with less than 200 hours of flight time. By April, the 8th Air Force had achieved air superiority. Bomber losses dropped from 8% to less than 2%. The P-51s were now unleashed on German airfields, strafing aircraft on the ground before they could even take off. By May, the Luftwaffe was losing more aircraft on the ground than in the air. On D-Day, June 6, 1944, the Allies flew over 14,000 sorties. The Luftwaffe managed only 100. The P-51 had made the invasion possible. Without the long-range escort, the bombing campaign would have failed. Without the bombing campaign, air superiority would not have been won. Without air superiority, the D-Day landings might have been a catastrophe. After the war, Hermann Goring's answer was direct. He stated that the long-range fighter was the most decisive factor, and its appearance over Berlin came as a complete surprise. The pilots flew the missions, but their lives depended on men who rarely saw the sky. The mechanics worked 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week, in rain and freezing temperatures. They changed engines, repaired battle damage, and loaded 1,800 rounds of ammunition by hand per aircraft before dawn. They started pre-flight inspections at 0400 in the dark. If a pilot reported a problem, they had minutes to fix it. Delays meant dead crews. They understood the stakes. The P-51 changed the strategic equation. It proved that range was more important than raw performance. The ability to be at the target was more valuable than being slightly faster. This lesson would influence aircraft design for decades. Blakesley himself flew until he was forcibly grounded in October 1944 headquarters unwilling to risk losing him. He had amassed over 1,000 combat hours. The 4th Fighter Group, his group, would become the highest-scoring American fighter group in the theater. When asked about the Berlin missions years later, his reply was simple. We did what needed to be done. By May 1945, the Luftwaffe barely existed. It had been starved of fuel and bled dry of experienced pilots. The P-51 had won the air war, not just with speed, but through the simple revolutionary ability to be there. The Senate War Investigating Committee called it the most aerodynamically perfect plane. General Arnold called its appearance a great miracle. But the bomber crews expressed it most simply. They called the P-51s their little friends. When those silver fighters slid into position, it was more than just an escort. It was hope. Wars are won by ordinary people doing extraordinary things. The P-51 succeeded because of thousands of individuals, pilots, mechanics, engineers, and factory workers. On March 6, 1944, Blakesley wasn't trying to make history. He was just doing his job. But for the German pilots who saw those fighters over Berlin, the implications were immediate. The math was clear. The escorts weren't turning back. The Luftwaffe was being ground down by attrition, and there was no way to stop it. When those silver Mustangs appeared over the Nazi capital, circling at 30,000 feet, the outcome of the air war was no longer in doubt.